and
That's good, because I was being really serious about that.
yeah, I know it. I could get a sign out here. If we had that reader board, we could probably advertise and we'd probably have a bunch of people doing it. Okay.
So I have started the recording if you are ready to go, and I will keep an eye out for Councilmember Hochstetter. I did send her an invite link, so.
Good, okay.
All right.
Okay, I'd like to call to order the City of Sumner study session. The date is August 24th of 2020 and the time is 6:05. As a reminder, City Hall remains closed during the governor's Safe Start, Stay Healthy order, consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the public has been invited to attend the meeting virtually by using the Zoom meeting access information on our website. I would note that all council members are present except for Councilmember Hochstetter, who is still trying to gain access through her Zoom link, and we anticipate her doing so. And we have also absent is Councilmember Peterson, but that absence is excused because she had let us know prior to the meeting tonight. We have two items on the agenda under regular business. One is review of utility rates, and the other one is diversity and equity update and discussion. With that, Jason, do I turn it over to you or do we go directly to Chris?
Let's go to Mr. Dahlem to introduce the topic.
Mr. Dahlem, introduce the topic.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and council members. Mike Dahlem, Public Works Director. Tonight we bring before you rate analysis. Through the 2021-22 budget, we hired FCS Group to review our rates and revenue needs, and also the system development charges, the SDCs, for the water, sewer, and storm utilities. FCS Chris Gonzalez will be presenting the methodology used and the assumptions used to determine those rates. We also looked at the SDCs, or the rate discounts we have for non-residentials, and see if those were still applicable. And we looked at the multi-family equivalent service units that we use to determine our rates in our SDCs. And if that doesn't make sense to you right now, Chris will clarify all that. Also, on the line tonight, we have Jason Van Gilder, Associate Engineer, Michael Kosa, Associate Engineer, could also answer questions if Chris doesn't have all the answers for us. So I'll turn it over to Chris to give the presentation.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Go ahead, Chris. And Chris, you're still muted.
Thank you for that. Okay, so let me just get this in slideshow. Can you see my presentation?
I think everybody, yep.
Okay, good.
On mine, assume it does, and everyone else's.
All right. So just quick agenda. I think Mike provided some background. I might provide a little bit more. I'll discuss the methodology behind the revenue requirement analysis, which we use to determine what rates need to be to cover your costs. And then also for the system development charge update. We'll go over the assumptions and findings and handle any questions that you have. I would say feel free to interrupt me if you have questions as we go through this. So it'll be a little bit more topical. These are your current utility rates. We typically start off with this just to provide context for what we're looking at. The water rates, we charge a monthly base rate based on meter size, and that reflects greater potential demands on the system for those larger service connections. There is a charge per 100 cubic feet or 100 CF of water consumption, and that starts at $2.12 for the first 1,000 cubic feet, and then it goes up progressively as you use more water. On the sewer side, we've got a flat rate for single family. Actually, I'm sorry, the minimum charge for single family and the other classes that you can see there. And then there's a charge for any water usage over 500 cubic feet per month. And then the stormwater rate is just a monthly rate per equivalent service unit. That's what ESU means. And the city's municipal code defines an ESU as 3,100 square feet of impervious area. So the general methodology behind the revenue requirement analysis is when we start out with a policy framework, how do we set reserves? To what extent do we fund capital through rates and things like that to help us figure out how much revenue is enough. And then we go on to the operating side and we forecast based on your operating budget what the operating costs are. You've got debt repayment schedules of principal and interest on loans and bonds. And then we've also got a capital improvement plan with kind of the bigger projects year by year, and then the funding strategy that we develop to help pay for those things. And so it all comes together as a revenue requirement, which tells us, how much revenue do rates need to generate in a given year. And we typically look beyond the current and upcoming biennium just to make sure that we don't have any surprises waiting. So we really have a goal of setting moderate, stable rate increases every year instead of not doing anything and then coming back in 10 years and saying, oh, we have to raise rates 50% because we're behind. So, and the city has been really good about keeping up with those proactive rate adjustments. And we've been looking at the rates every 2 years for at least the last, I want to say 3 or 4 cycles that I've been involved with. And so the rate increases have been very stable and moderate. The system development charge methodology, this is a connection charge that the RCW authorizes the city to charge to recover a proportionate share of the cost of system infrastructure from development. So this isn't on the ongoing operations side. This is, we put all this infrastructure in place and we want to make sure that development pays for an equitable share of it. And the general methodology that the city has been using, we look at the cost of existing system assets, and then we divide that by the total equivalent unit capacity of the system, and we come up with kind of an average cost for the existing system. And then we look for the future part, we look at growth related projects that are needed to provide capacity for growth, and then we allocate that to that growth. So this is known as a buy-in plus growth methodology, where everybody makes sure that they pay an equitable buy-in to the existing system and then also mitigate the impacts of the projects that they're driving. Key assumptions, we've got our annual cost inflation rates. General inflation, like the consumer price index, we're looking at roughly 2.3% in the near term. Salaries and wages, 2 to 4% per year. The different benefits have their own escalation rates, medical being the highest at 7%, vision being relatively flat, and then a couple kind of below inflation. But we basically go through the line item detail of the budget and apply these escalators as appropriate. We start with the 2021-22 budget and then build off of that. Taxes, we calculate based on projected revenues. And then there are also some budget requests for staffing or professional services or other things that we adjust the budget to reflect. We're also assuming that the system is growing at a rate of 1% per year, which gives you about 65 equivalent residential units for water and sewer, and about 200 equivalent stormwater or equivalent service units for stormwater per year. And so that will affect rate revenue, but also SDC revenue. General policy assumptions, we have an operating reserve that provides sufficient cash flow to accommodate short-term revenue and expense cycles. And to give you an example of what that means, your revenues for water and sewer, mainly water, are seasonal. And so you tend to pull more revenue in during the summer and then less during the winter, but you're not paying staff seasonally, you're paying them a fixed amount. And so your revenues have a different pattern than your expenses do. And so we want to make sure there's a reserve that can absorb that so that you can pay your bills when you need to. The minimum balance, we try to keep at least 60 days of operating expenses for each utility in reserve to account for these sorts of variations in cash flow. And for water and stormwater, they're about the same, 454,000 for water, 426,000 for stormwater. Sewer is kind of a larger utility with the treatment facility. And so that would be $929,000 is that 60-day reserve. And so then on top of operating reserves, we've got a capital reserve that provides a source of funding for emergency repairs, unanticipated capital projects, and cost overruns. And typically we look at 1 to 2% of the cost of system assets. We're using 1% in this case. And so for water, that's 264,000, sewer 512,000, and stormwater 174,000. And these reserves are on hand in case they're needed. We generally don't plan to draw the balances below these levels, understanding that in reality, there may be unforeseen circumstances where you would have to dip below these balances. And then when that happens, there's a plan to replenish the reserves over a couple of years. So onto the water results. The capital plan for water includes about $26.9 million in capital projects from now through 2026. Source, particularly water rights investments, are about 10.6 million of that. Another 9.4 million in different distribution and transmission system main improvements. There's almost 4.5 million for reservoir improvements. And then 1.9 million in equipment and related maintenance, and then some other miscellaneous projects at 613,000. Cash we're expecting will be sufficient to cover about 60% of those costs. And when I say cash, I mean existing reserve balances, but also cash that rates are generating as part of the financial policies. And so we are projecting that there'll be a bond issue of about $8.8 million to provide $8 million in net proceeds. And a large part of that will be for the water rights project. You'll see in the pie chart that there are $2.7 million in grants or contributions, which would offset these capital costs. Some of that is for the water rights. I want to say it was around 2 million of that is related to the water rights. But this bond that we're projecting is going to increase the water utilities annual debt service by about $646,000.
Chris, before you go on the next one, just for the record, I'd note that Councilmember Hochstetter has joined us. Go ahead.
Okay. So the revenue requirement forecast, the bar chart here is basically showing the key components of the revenue requirement, including operating expenses, kind of the dark blue bottom level, debt service on top of that. You can see just visually that when we get out to 23, 24, the size of that bar starts to increase to reflect that additional debt service. And then the difference is rate funding for capital. The solid line represents your revenues at existing rates. And then the dashed line reflects the revenue at the projected rates. And so what you see from the graph is, I mean, your revenues are sufficient to cover operating expenses and debt service through the study period. You do need rate increases to keep generating cash for capital. I would say that if you didn't do any of the increases, you might have less cash and might have to borrow more. So some of these proportions might change, particularly towards the end of the period. But we are projecting, based on the needs right now, 2.5% per year for the next biennium. And then where we had projected last time that you'd be able to keep those 2.5% increases, we're projecting slightly higher increases, 3% per year. And that's being driven by the debt service related to that water rights project. And you can see based on a typical residential bill at 700 cubic feet per month or 7 CCF, these increases equate to roughly $1 to $1.25 per year in the monthly bill. The water SDC, like I said before, we start out looking at the cost of the existing system. That increased slightly from 2018 with the addition of assets and the accrual of interest. Statute allows up to 10 years of interest accrual on existing assets. And so you can see we added about 1.3 million total to the cost basis. And then the meter equivalents are roughly the same. We use an inventory of current customers by meter size and then adjust that for projected growth. But overall, that part of the charge is remaining relatively similar, just under 3,000 to almost 3,200. The future part, you can see there's a slightly bigger increase in the future cost basis, and that is driven primarily by that water rights project, which was not in our plan 2 years ago. So if we're adding like 7 or so million and in consultation with staff, it sounds like that's largely going to be getting additional water rights capacity to serve future development. So it's very, very much a growth related cost. And so that part of the charge was $2,800 last time. And now under the new calculation, it's over 4,000. And so what we're looking at is based on these two pieces, the water SDC per meter equivalent is increasing from the existing level of $5,791 to $7,191. And I think when reviewing this with staff, we had discussed the potential for phasing this in. So looking at like maybe $500 increases each year for the next 2 years. And then by the time we get to that point, we'll recalculate it to make sure that it's on track before we make any other adjustments. Any questions on the water results?
Questions, anybody, any council members? So what you're saying, Chris, is that from the 5791, you're talking about instead of making a big jump all at once, is go through $500 increments, reevaluate it the next time you go through your analysis and, see whether you're on target or not.
That's right. And I mean, you certainly have that authority to phase that in. I think the development community tends to appreciate the heads up and being able to adjust their own plans. The downside to that approach is obviously the less you recover from development, the more you shift to existing customers. But having said that, there are utilities that don't update their SDCs every 2 years. So, I mean, there's some degree of that anyway. So yeah, I think it's prudent, especially with the economic impacts of the current pandemic, recognizing that there is an increased cost that we need to recover, but phasing that in to cushion the blow a little bit.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
So on to sewer. The sewer utility is projecting about 9.3 million in capital projects. 3.8 are related to collection system improvements. The treatment plant accounts for about 2.5 million of upgrades. Additional investments of 1.1 million in pump stations, and then 1.8 million in other miscellaneous capital projects. Cash is expected to cover pretty much everything here. The utility balances and rate contribution is about 83%. We're projecting, based on the city's agreement with the city of Bonnie Lake, they get roughly 56% of the capital cost for treatment plant investments. And so that's basically the 1.4 million that we're showing in that pie chart is their share of that 2.5 million for the treatment plant upgrades. And then there was another project with another 100,000 of grants, but we're not needing any new debt issuance on the sewer side. There's enough in cash resources and other external funding sources to cover those costs. The sewer rate strategy, kind of the same general story as water with regards to the key components of the revenue requirement. Last time we recommended 3% rate increases and showed that trend would be able to continue. And we're pretty much in that same position now. So there have not been any major changes to impact the rate strategy. And because the sewer bill tends to be higher than the water bill, the percentages are going to result in a higher dollar increase on their bill. And so you can see in the table there, we're more like $2 to $250 basically per year in the monthly sewer bill. And then on the sewer side, running through the SDC calculation, we added assets and interest accrued. We're looking at a comparable number of ERUs. And so the charge itself has increased slightly, a little bit less than $500. Like I think it's like $460-ish. And that is consistent with inflationary types of additions, but driven by an update of the actual calculation. The CIP, the future growth-related portion of the CIP is slightly lower than what we were looking at last time. But overall comparable and the type of increase we'd expect to see from a relatively frequent update. Any questions on sewer?
Questions, anybody? Seeing none. Go ahead, Chris.
All right, we will charge into stormwater. This discussion will merit a little more background because the stormwater rates, we're doing a little bit more than we did on water and sewer. You may remember at the beginning of the presentation when I went over the rate structure, I noted that the rate structure is imposed based on equivalent service units. And for single family, the city code, consistent with what most other utilities do, they assign one ESU per parcel. So regardless, just given the size of the single family class, it's not really practical to measure, tens of thousands of parcels. And so typically, regardless of the size, they're assigned one ESU. Multifamily properties are assigned 0.8 ESUs per dwelling unit. So a duplex would be 2, triplex would be 3, fourplex would be 4 times that 0.8 and so forth. And then everybody else gets assigned ESUs based on measured impervious area, with 3,100 square feet being an ESU. And the picture at the bottom of the slide kind of gives you a sense of the scale. The purple rectangle basically shows you what 3,100 square feet of impervious area looks like, and then City Hall for reference. So, I mean, it looks like just visually, the City Hall would be somewhere between 4 and 5 ESUs based on the area. Oh, sorry. And so then the rate credits, Mike had mentioned that we were looking at some changes to the rate credits. The city currently offers 4 stormwater rate credits. There's a 25% credit for direct discharge to the river. There's a 50% credit for an independent site permit, 50% credit for low impact development, and then a 40% credit for a standard storm system or like an on-site mitigation system. In general, these credits would only be available for non-residential customers, and they can receive up to 2, and the city would apply basically the 2 highest credits. And so what I would draw your attention to is the 40% credit for the on-site mitigation. That has historically been based on these sites providing more than what has been required. But as standards for mitigation have evolved and the requirements have gotten tighter, right now the city is effectively offering a 40% credit to non-residential customers for something that they already have to do. And so as a result, we were asked to evaluate the impacts of eliminating that credit. And in that case, the businesses would, they could qualify for the other 3 credits, but would otherwise pay the same rate per ESU that everyone else does.
Chris, I just want to make sure going back to that one, that people understand is that the 40% standard discount was at one point was based upon them doing something that was in excess of what was required by the state and subsequently by the city. But now the standards and the requirements have changed such that, what they're given a discount for, they have to do in any case. It is a requirement. So you're essentially be the same thing for a residential property, to be giving them a discount for something that they normally would have to do. So you're looking at that as being something different than the other 3.
There's a question from Councilmember Reed.
Councilmember Reed.
Yes, and I may be jumping ahead here, but do we know what that translates to in $2?
You are jumping ahead, Patrick, and we'll be getting to that. So we'll be getting to that one. Councilmember Botetto.
So the direct discharge to the river, do they have to do any sort of cleaning or filtering the water, or is it just direct, going into the river without any treatment?
So I can help with that. Typically, when they develop a site, they have to detain water and also treat it before it's
Okay.
discharged even into our system or anywhere. So direct discharge into the river, they don't have to detain it, but they still have to treat it.
Okay.
It doesn't affect our system as much as something going into our pipes where it's just going directly to the river.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Seeing none, go ahead, Chris.
All right. So there are a couple of rate structure revisions that we are recommending as part of this study. As we've been discussing, the 40% non-residential standard stormwater system credit is being provided for activities that are now mandatory. Non-discounted properties generate 27% of runoff, but pay for 40% of the stormwater utilities annual costs. So there is an equity issue that we're trying to address by getting rid of this credit. And then the other recommendation would be on the multifamily side, instead of charging or assigning ESUs to them based on dwelling units, which, I mean, if you think about a multi-level apartment building, you know, you have more units, but it doesn't necessarily tie to impervious area, which is the most common, I would say, measure used to quantify runoff generation. And so what we're recommending is that we move from dwelling units to impervious area. And especially as the multifamily development densifies over time, you're going to have a greater number of units packed into a relatively unchanged space. And so I think by keeping it based on dwelling units, you would tend to overcharge multifamily relative to the runoff that they're generating. And so right now, I mean, an example that staff had provided, the newest developments on the multifamily side are paying about 3 times what a similarly sized commercial parcel pays based on the number of units that they've got. And so the estimated impact of that change is roughly a 0.5% decrease in annual rate revenue. And the monthly bill for a typical multifamily account would decrease by roughly $14. That's the estimate. So, I mean, overall, I mean, the impact, at least compared to the status quo now, is relatively minor. And this would actually be the best time to address this, because if we continue to go based on dwelling units, I mean, there'll be some newer developments that pay a lot more, and then having to change this later, the impacts would be that much greater. So looking at the commercial users, if eliminating the 40% rate credit would increase annual rate revenue by about 1.3 million, which is about 1/3 of what you're currently taking in. There's a material rate impact of doing this. I mean, the customers that are currently getting a 40% credit would see a 40% rate increase as a result of this. There are a number of businesses that get more than one credit, so their increase might not actually be 40%, but it would likely be at least double digit. But what this would allow the city to do is forego any rate increases or SDC increases for the next biennium. And it provides additional capacity to cash fund some planned projects. And as I'll get into in a few minutes, there are a couple of really big stormwater projects where there's considerable uncertainty, and having the extra revenue will definitely help the utility navigate the completion of those projects. Is looking at the overall bill impact, it looks like the majority of the accounts would see either an increase of up to $250 in their monthly stormwater bill. I would note that some of these businesses have really large bills because they have really large impervious areas. And when you think about like a Costco or a shopping mall or something, then you're dividing 3,100 square feet. I mean, you're getting multiple ESUs. And so if we're talking about a $250 increase, that sounds like a lot, and it is a lot. But I mean, if the bill is 10 times that, then on a percentage basis, it might not be as bad. So basically all the slides from here on out assume that we implement both of those changes. And so the stormwater utility we're projecting is going to spend almost $80 million in capital projects from now through 2026. And 51 million of that is related to the 24th Street setback levy. Another almost 11 million is related to the White River improvements, and then everything else is about 17 million. The city is expecting a considerable amount of grant funding. So you can see in that pie chart, almost 3/4 of the CIP is going to be grant funded, at least based on the projections at this point. But as I said on the previous slide, having additional revenue that you can put towards this helps protect against the risk of grants not materializing to the extent that you're projecting that they're going to materialize. And then the pie chart also shows that the cash resources, so rate contributions and existing balances, will cover the rest of it without any debt. Stormwater revenue requirement. Last time we were projecting 3% increases per year for the next couple of biennium. And then we're able to, with the rate structure change, we're able to keep rates level for the next 2 years and then go back to our projected rate strategy beyond that. So 3% for 2023 and 24, and then 2.5% per year in 25 and 26. And then you can see the increases beyond 2022. I mean, you're looking at roughly 50-cent increases in the monthly bill each year. And then the stormwater SDC calculation, we came up with the same calculation that we did for water and sewer. And it gives us something comparable to the existing charge. So 2813 was the existing charge per ESU, and we're at like 2821. Part of the reason, despite the increase in costs, the number of ESUs increased with the change in the commercial structure, specifically the credits. And so we're recommending that you just keep the existing charge rather than increasing it by a few dollars.
Yeah, Chris, before you go on beyond that one, when we start talking about the 40% discount and the increased revenue that comes in, from certain businesses because of that loss, isn't some of that, and this is also for Mike, isn't that some of that going to projects, such as the 24th Street setback levy and the White River project, which is protecting the very area in which those businesses are located?
Yeah, I mean, without the specifics of like the location, I mean, my understanding is that those projects will benefit those properties, perhaps disproportionately so, considering what's zoned commercial versus residential. But
okay, any other questions anybody has before we get into what's the overall net impact here, comparisons? Okay, go ahead, Chris.
Okay. And so if we combine water, sewer, and stormwater, right now, a typical residence using 7 CCF per month would pay $127.72. And then based on the proposed rates for the next biennium, we're looking at about 2.5% rate increases. And with the consumer price index somewhere like between 2 and 2.5%, I mean, it's basically inflationary level adjustments. And then once we get outside of the biennium, we're looking at something more like 3% increases, which is still very moderate and consistent with inflation overall. The bill impacts are comparable, actually a little bit lower than what we were projecting last time. And I think that's in part due to the stormwater rate change, the fact that we were projecting like 50-cent type of increases for 21 and 22 that were that now aren't going to happen under the recommended scenario. And then if we wanted to look at how the city's rates compare to other utilities rates, with the caveat that every utility has its own circumstances and policies and things like that, the city's rates right now result in a bill for a single family user using 7 CCF per month that's pretty much in the middle of the range. You've got a few communities that are lower, you've got a few that are higher. And it will largely stay that way. So with the proposed rate increases for 21, the relative ranking doesn't change. And I think there's definitely I mean, looking at kind of the increase from $127 or $130 to Buckley, which is $138. I'd expect that as these other utilities increase their rates, the city is still going to remain competitive with the other utilities in the region.
So
and then, I'm sorry.
Note that on those is that this is the total bill the customer receives, but also because, as you noted, it includes the applicable utility taxes. Case in point, where Sumner is at 6%, and I think that Bonnie Lake is at 12%. So that's all incorporated into that final number that you have up there.
Yes.
Okay.
And then on the SDC side, we've got, I would say you're sort of slightly higher than the middle of the group, but overall consistent with the middle of the group. The comparison here, I mean, right now, a new residential connection in the city would pay $13,230, and we're showing that increasing to $14,156. Buckley and Bonnie Lake are higher. The others are lower. I think the important thing to recognize for this type of comparison for SDCs is that there's no prescribed frequency for how often you update these charges, and they vary more than rates do because of methodology differences and how often utilities update them, how they phase things in, even if they have the option of increasing it. So, I mean, this type of comparison is even more subjective than the rate comparison, but I think the point being overall that you are comparable with a lot of these other utilities and not outlandish by any means. And so to summarize the recommendations, we are recommending that you increase water rates or adopt water rate increases of 2.5% per year for 21 and 22, sewer rate increases of 3% per year for the next biennium, and then stormwater, there's no action necessary. And then adopting the updated SCCs, we're looking at basically roughly $500 a year. Like I basically phase the increase in 3 steps. So from $57.91 to that $7,100 number, with the understanding that we'll be revisiting the calculation next time, and we'll figure out like where we need to go from there. But then for sewer and sewer, we're talking about just adopting the increase effective 2021. And then for stormwater, with the recommended change to the ESU assignment policies, there's no increase needed. And then the bullets below basically highlight those rate structure revisions. So changing multifamily ESUs to be based on impervious area instead of dwelling units, eliminating that 40% non-residential stormwater rate credit, and then kind of a universal recommendation is continuing to monitor things and adjust as needed. And the city has been really great about doing that, and that's why we're seeing inflationary rate increases instead of something more shocking. And so with that, that's the end of the formal presentation. So I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Any other questions that council members have for Mr. Gonzalez? Patrick, did you get your question answered? I thought it was coming up here, so just want to make sure.
I think it did for the most part. My one follow-up would be, so it's essentially translates out to about $3 to $5 per household increase for water and sewer.
So water, yeah, I mean, basically with no increase of stormwater, we're looking at, for a typical residence, about $3 increase in the monthly bill for the next couple of years. And then as we get out past the biennium, looking more like 4-ish.
Thank you. And I did have kind of along the multifamily unit and the increases in their bills. And I saw the graph that you had that had varied stages, it looked like, or of number of units.
Well, this was for commercial. I don't think there was a graph for multifamily.
Okay. That's
yeah, I mean, there was this type of thing, but.
Because if I just wanted to see, because I know whenever rates increase, if apartment owners, for example, take a hit, that translates into rent increases. I was just curious, not saying this isn't the right way to go, just making sure that that's not something that could potentially surprise people.
Yeah, I would say in my experience, utility rate increases could impact the bill, but I think rents are also driven by market rates, which don't necessarily consider them. So there may be an impact, but I mean, kind of the same way that if we said that there was a decrease to them, you know, that wouldn't necessarily decrease rent. So yeah, I mean, I would say ultimately the impacts vary in the class. I would say the ones that are going to benefit the most are the ones that have more units packed into a smaller area. The more dense units are going to, multifamily buildings are going to benefit more. The ones that are less dense, where you've got fewer units on a larger impervious area, they're going to see potentially an increase depending on the rate.
Great, thank you.
Okay, Kathy.
Oh, yeah, Chris, I just want to thank you for the presentation and especially the pictures and the graphs, and that it is a lot of information to absorb, and that made it a lot easier. Not too bad for a guy sitting in a car. Thank you.
I'm going to be known as that guy. Well, I'm glad that it helped. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Charlotte.
Thank you. And for the helpful presentation, thank you for the regional comparisons. I was going to stay quiet, but I realized, but I didn't want my, but my silence was more about me processing than it was just absolute approval. I may, just a heads up, I may call you with questions to play around with some of the rates, like similar to an EIS, like alternatives. What happens if it's not the full amount, and if we end up somewhere in the middle? And also, while I appreciate like the residential bill comparison, and this part is not on you, this is just my general hesitancy, is that I would prefer, think about in terms of economic development, where one bill doesn't make or break where someone will choose to develop. And I just suspect that in times of coronavirus, that if there are people developing, that we would like them to be drawn to Sumner, but they look at everything as a package. And so just know that I'm trying to look at all of these and like this information in the bigger context in terms of our whole budget and not just one department's. And anyway, I'm just thinking because in case we're looking to raise, I would say, rates everywhere, rates or taxes, etc. Anyway, I'm just flagging my delayed processing.
Understood. There's a lot of information there. I would just, and Charlie, if you have any questions and stuff, I would just make sure staff loop.
I will. I'll call. I just didn't want to take anyone by surprise.
Right. Yep.
I will.
Appreciate it.
I don't know where I am. Thanks.
Okay. Other questions, comments, council members? Okay. Seeing none. Thank you very much, Chris. It's probably one of the more unique settings that we've had in terms of a Zoom meeting, of you making the presentation in your car with your 2-year-old. That's the first one for me right there. So that was worth the price of admission right there. So thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much. And for all your good work and explanation of a very complex subject. I appreciate it.
Sure thing. And yeah, I mean, if there are any other questions, yeah, just just send them to staff, and they can contact me, and I'd be happy to give any other information that I can.
Okay.
And Chris will send you a copy of Robert's Rules Kids Edition to help you out with that as well.
Thank you.
Oh boy, I tell you. Okay. Mike or Jason, anything more on this particular one?
Yeah, I'll just kind of highlight the next steps here. At the first study session in September, we'll be going over the utility rate capital. This is setting rates is one of the most important parts of the budget process because that's how the rest of the budget is built on, particularly in the utility funds. This is also going to be before you for official adoption on September 21st as one of the first steps of moving through the budget process. So if you have any questions that come up, please work directly with Mike to get those addressed as soon as can.
Okay. Hey, great. Hey, thank you very much. Yeah, Chris, I guess that's it. You can actually
Drive away.
in your car or whatever it is you're gonna do. Last time we saw Chris Gonzalez, he was sitting in his car, and we're just hopeful that after he signs off of this meeting is that he will then maybe leave at a certain point. So
Yes, I'm going to get out of my car as soon as I get off this.
Oh, okay, that's good. Hi, Cindy. Your picture's on. That's good. Nice to see you.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for your time, and it's been a pleasure as always.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Take care. Okay.
Thanks. You too. Bye.
That was different. Okay. Now we're going to move on to diversity and equity update and discussion. Jason, we call on you.
Yes, sir. So council, before you tonight, we're going to be talking about diversity and equity. This is one of the items that council asked for regular updates on. So we're going to try to add it to an agenda at least once a month. And the process that we're going to go through is actually, we're going to start with a little bit of learning, because learning together about systemic racism is really important to understanding how you as policymakers can affect change in our community. So tonight we're going to start with about a 20-minute video. It's put on by Robin DiAngelo, who's the author of White Fragility. She's going to be talking about systemic racism and in particular about the good-bad binary of racism. So we'll start with that, and then I will follow up with just some bullet points of what staff has been working on over the last 30 days or so. Let me get my screen pulled up here.
I'm Dr. Robin DiAngelo, and my work focuses on the question of what does it mean to be.
Just want to make sure everybody can hear it. Can somebody say yes?
Yes.
Thank you, because I can't see you.
Yeah,
Appreciate
I can hear it.
White in a society that proclaims race meaningless, yet is profoundly separated by race. And to start this off, I want to draw your attention to the fact that I'm white. So just look at me for a moment, think about it, notice it. And part of being white is that is a very uncomfortable thing for me to do. And it's taken me many, many years to be able to draw people's attention to my race and see any significance in it. And that's because as a white person, I was socialized to see race as what they had. I was just a person. I was just a white bread, a Heinz 57. I didn't have race. I was socialized to see race as individual acts of discrimination and prejudice, individual acts that anybody could do to anybody else, and if you did those acts, you were a bad person. And that is why, since I saw myself as a good person, I didn't see myself as connected to racism, and certainly didn't see myself as connected to race. In other words, I didn't have a sense of a racial identity. Today, I understand that I move through the world always and most particularly as a white person. I have a white frame of reference and I have a white experience. And part of being white is to have that be invisible to us and to be able to live our lives without ever acknowledging that, to see that as non-operative. I now understand racism as a system, as a deeply embedded system, a system that our country was founded on and that all our institutions were created out of. And every institution reinforces this system. And it's a system of unequal power. So let me give you an example. Women in the United States got the right to vote in 1920. And there was only one possible way that we could have gotten the right to vote, and that was for men to give it to us, because we literally were not sitting in the seats of institutional power. We could not give ourselves the right to vote. That doesn't mean that we couldn't have personal power, but we didn't have institutional power. And that's the difference between a system and individual acts. Prior to women's suffrage, I could certainly discriminate against men. I could be unfair to individual men, but my group could not systematically deny men as a group the right to vote. And men controlled all the institutions, and they all worked together to convey the message that women's place was here and men's place was there. And that's the difference between individual prejudice and a system of inequality. So in this field, we think about oppression, or in this case, racism, as group prejudice backed by institutional power. And so prior to the civil rights movement, it was fairly socially acceptable for white people to just come out and say, we are superior. But post-civil rights, it became bad to be racist, right? It became unacceptable to be racist. And that seems like a positive thing, right? Racism's bad. But unfortunately, what it morphed into is to make it impossible for white people to look at racism, because what we hear is, I would have to be a bad person in order to perpetuate racism. It became a moral issue. In addition to years of reflection and study of my own racial identity and how it shapes my life and my experience and my perspectives, I've had the very rare opportunity to, for a living, day in and day out, lead primarily white groups of people in discussions of race and racism. And there are some very, very predictable patterns that come up in these conversations. And as I listen to these, it's almost like a script. And as I listen to white folks, my group, repeat these narratives over and over, I got this image of a dock, like a pier, and it's just floating on the water, and that's all the superficial things that we say. And you probably recognize some of these, you hear them, maybe you've said them yourself. I don't see color. I was taught to treat everybody the same. I don't care if you're pink, blue, purple, polka dotted. My parents weren't racist, that's why I'm not racist. Or my parents were racist, that's why I'm not racist. It doesn't really matter what goes in front of it. The answer is always, I'm not racist. I know people of color. I used to work in the military. All of the things we say to rationalize that we ourselves are not complicit in this system. Now I want to speak to two of these before I kind of take us below the surface of the dock. And one is this idea that our parents taught us to treat everyone the same. And I am just going to put it out there like this. No, they didn't. That is not humanly possible. Human beings are not objective. You cannot be taught to treat or to see everyone the same. And when you say that, you're indicating that you don't understand how socialization works, which is actually a positive thing in the sense that that can direct what you would need to focus on if you want to get deeper understanding. The other one I want to speak to is this common trope of, I don't care if you're pink, purple, polka dotted. If that's in your vocabulary, I would urge you to please drop it and never say it again. Although it isn't intentional, it's actually very demeaning. People don't come in those colors, and what it conveys is that you're not prepared to engage with authenticity. Okay? And that's why I have this image of a dock, right? That's very superficial surface. And for me, in trying to understand how all this works, what it means to be white, and live so separate by race, even though I was taught to see myself individually as open-minded and outside of all of this, I've had to go under the surface. And that's why I have this image here now of under the water. You see the pier, the pillars or posts that prop up the surface, okay? So, for example, it's very common in discussions of race to have white people tell you about all the people of color in their lives, right? Oh, I have these coworkers, or my best friend, or my second cousin married a black man, or all of the ways that we want everyone to know that we have relationships with people of color, okay? And so we're giving you evidence, right? When someone tells you that, they're giving you evidence. And so what are they giving you evidence of? They're giving you evidence that because they love people of color, know and love people of color, they can't be racist, which means they see racism as conscious dislike or explicit bias or hatred, right? And they're communicating to you that they don't have conscious dislike or hatred, as evidenced by all of these people in their lives. And what we don't understand is the power of implicit bias. Most bias is unconscious. And that makes it very, very dangerous because it drives our behaviors, but we're not aware of it. Yes, it's wonderful to have people of color in your life if you're white. Many, many, many people, white people, don't have people of color in close relationships. But that doesn't mean your life is free of racism. That doesn't mean you don't have a white experience or a white perspective. And it also doesn't mean that racism will not surface in your relationships with people of color. So if we go underneath and we look at the pillars that are supporting that kind of superficial ways that we're taught to think about racism, we see individualism as a very powerful prop or support, this idea that each of us is unique and outside of socialization. We see universalism, which is kind of the opposite of individualism. Individualism says, why can't we all be different? And universalism says, why can't we all be the same? This is a very popular ideology in religious or faith communities. And I'm not arguing that on a deep spiritual level, we're not all universally the same. But we don't live, if you will, in the spiritual realm. We live in the physical realm. And here in the physical realm, we have to ask ourselves, how does it function to say we all bleed under the skin? Well, it functions to take race off the table, to take power off the table, to deny that we have fundamentally different experiences, because racism is real. And while race isn't real, in other words, at the biological level, there is no real, true race or racial difference as we're taught to understand it, these very superficial signifiers of racial difference that allow us to categorize people, these are very real in their consequences for people's lives. And this insistence that we're all one doesn't allow us to engage with that social reality. I try to help white people see how race functions in our lives. And I try to move us away from the really obvious, evident examples, such as a racist joke or a racist action, or things that would be recognizable to everybody, right? The kinds of acts that cause people like me, well-meaning people like me, to say, I couldn't possibly be racist, I don't do those things. And I try to help white people understand racism as the very fabric of our society. Many people can recognize the explicit, kind of conscious dislike type of racism, racist jokes, racist expressions, the KKK. But I want to help white people see the everyday racism that's embedded and that we participate in. And I want to look at neighborhood and school segregation as an example. I'm going to start with this app here. These are the app's founders. It's a new app called The Sketch Factor. And what it does is when you go to a new city, you can put in where you are, and it tells you which neighborhoods to avoid because they're sketchy. And of course, sketchy is very much associated with race and class in the white mind. And so now we have the convenience of segregation through an app. We don't actually have to talk to other white people about, where are the good neighborhoods and the bad neighborhoods. And that good neighborhood, bad neighborhood, good schools, bad schools discourse is an example of new racism. I don't think it gets by anybody that is racially coded language. So this way we can come out and police those racial boundaries without ever kind of naming race. But we all know what we're talking about. And I think the most profound way that my life has been shaped by my race is through the power of segregation. Most white people do live in segregation. We choose that segregation. And in a lot of ways, we celebrate it. What makes a school good and what makes a neighborhood good? Well, the absence of people of color. That is the way that white people measure the value of their neighborhoods and schools. And while we don't come out and name that, we all know what it is. And so I have had to think very deeply on what it means to have grown up in a primarily white neighborhood, to be born into, to go to school, to study, to learn, to play, to worship, to love, to work, and to die in segregation, and not have one single person who loved, mentored, or guided me convey that there was any loss. And I'm going to repeat that because I think it's very profound, and I really want us to sit with it. That I could live my whole life in segregation. In fact, if I followed the trajectory that my loving parents laid out for me in my good neighborhood and my good school and my good college and my good career, in which I would ideally rise to the top, I could easily never have any consistent, ongoing, authentic relationships with people of color, and not one person who guided me ever conveyed that there was loss. Just sit with that for a moment, that there is no inherent value in the perspectives or experiences of people of color. If my parents, if my schools, if my curriculum, if my teachers, if my government saw value in those perspectives, I would be given those perspectives, but I wasn't given those perspectives. And that shapes my relationships. It shapes what I care about. It shapes what I see, what I don't see, who I build my life with, and who I don't build my life with. And that is the level where we really need to look at race inside of us and with us. In the line of work that I do, it's a breakthrough if you can get white people to acknowledge that our race privileges us in this society, right? That is like the second coming, to get white folks to admit that we are privileged by our race. But even that begins to get superficial. And you'll hear white people say, just because of the color of my skin, you know, I have these things, as if this is just an accident that happens. And I want to take us deeper. I want to take us inside this skin. My psychosocial development was inculcated in the water of white supremacy. That is what I call this system. I don't mean the KKK. I mean a system in which whiteness and white people are central and seen as inherently superior to people of color. My personality was formed in that water. My worldview was formed in that water. I didn't choose it. It isn't my fault. I'm not racked with guilt about it, but I am responsible for changing it, because the default of our society is the reproduction of racism. It's built into every system and every institution. And if we just live our lives and carry on in the most comfortable ways for us, we will necessarily reproduce it. There is no neutral space. Inaction is a form of action. One of the most effective adaptations of racism since the civil rights era is this idea of a racist is a bad person, and if you're not racist, you're a good person. What I call the good-bad binary. And we can all fill it in, right? So if you're racist, then you're prejudiced and mean-spirited and bigoted and ignorant and Southern and probably drive a pickup truck. So we got some classism in there, right? This is our racist. And if you're not racist, you're good and you're progressive and you're open-minded and you're educated and you're Northern. And this binary is probably the #1 construct that keeps racism today in place and makes it nearly impossible to talk to white people about racism. The defensiveness we have comes from this binary. What we hear is, you just said I was a bad person. And so this binary sets it up to be mutually exclusive. You cannot be a good person and be complicit with racism. So you'll notice in the news when racism gets talked about, they'll bring in the evidence they'll have to defend the person that's being accused of racism is, but he's a really nice person, right? Because again, it's mutually exclusive. We have to understand racism as a system that we're all a part of. You know, I often, in my trainings, after I've kind of laid out kind of how racism works, I'll ask people of color, how often have you given white people feedback on our inevitable, unaware and unintentional, but inevitable racism, and have that go well for you? And you know, there's eye rolls and laughter, and basically the answer is never, right? It's virtually impossible for people of color to give us feedback, because that binary sets us up to defend, right? I must at all costs deflect and establish that I am not racist, right? And that makes it so that we can't examine the reality of the society that we live in. And then I'll follow up and ask this question. So what would your daily life be like? This is a question I ask the people of color. If you could simply give us feedback when we step in it, which we inevitably will, and have us receive that with grace, reflect, and seek to do something different. What would your daily life be like? And recently, a man of color in the room, there was a pause, and then he said, it would be revolutionary. And I just want you to sit with that for a minute. Revolutionary, that white people would receive the feedback, reflect, and try to change our behavior. That would be a revolution. Returning to the pillars underneath the dock, now we can label them, right? So we have individualism, we have universalism, right? Individualism, why can't we all be different? Universalism, why can't we all be the same? They both function to take race off the table. We have internalized superiority that no white person can miss. It was not lost on me that fundamentally it is better to be white. I don't want that belief. I didn't ask for that belief, and I've committed my life to challenging it. But 24/7, that is what society reinforces for me. So internalized superiority is also one of the pillars. The good-bad binary is a very foundational pillar holding up new racism. And segregation, the power of segregation to keep this system in place. And for me, by identifying those pillars, it has helped guide me to then how would I challenge each of those things. And so I urge you to take this journey. It is lifelong. It won't be over in my lifetime. I will never be free of all of the investments in this system that I have that I can't see, but I have committed my life to doing my very best to continually challenge it. And I invite you, and in fact, urge you to do the same.
All righty.
Wow. It's a lot different watching her than it is reading.
Yeah, definitely. All righty. I'm going to share my screen again. Just a moment here. All right, so I thought I would create all right, sorry, had a weird pop-up. Okay, I thought I'd create a kind of a living document to show what staff is working on. Obviously, over the last almost 90 days now, diversity, equity, and inclusion has been something that staff has been putting extra emphasis on. I do want to say, though, that this is something that staff has always held very important, and that's evidenced in things that we've been doing for a number of years in this arena. It's evidenced in our grant applications and what we seek money for to make sure that we are providing equal funding throughout our community to provide great service. But I want to talk kind of about what we've been doing lately. And there are some blanks on here, and it really comes down to a resource issue and time. And I'll say coronavirus is also adding some challenges to some of these things, particularly in the education part. So staff training, I know we've talked about this before at council meetings. We are continuing to look for ways to expand staff training and looking primarily right now at remote options. We are looking at some options for 21 and 22 as part of our budget process to hopefully do more on-site stuff. But obviously with Corona, that's not possible right now. As the mayor just mentioned, the executive team, we've been doing a book study by Dr. Robin DeAngelo on white fragility. We are probably 2/3 of the way through that right now. It's been very good for our executive team. It's been a safe place to talk and to learn from each other. Last week, some of our council members, as well as a number of our staff, participated in the Association of Washington Cities REAL program, which is a partnership with National League of Cities on advancing racial equity and local government 101 training. When we do get the recording of that, I will be sending that out to all of council for their viewing. Tonight, you saw that we watched the Good Bad Binary video. Once again, it's our hope that we can provide education sessions to for council. I know it's something you've requested, and we want to make sure that those are valuable to you to help you in your policy-making role. Police review, we are continuing to, with our 90-day prohibition on LVNR, except for deadly force situations, talking to the police chief, he anticipates that will become permanent. We're just waiting on a few things from Lexipol, which is our policy partner, as well as the State Criminal Justice Training Commission. And then he's also in the process of looking at some expanded training plan for our police officers. The school district's equity task force, I met last week with them to discuss the task force goals. I'll be sending out tonight after the meeting the application for that and encourage any council members who are interested to apply. It will primarily focus on school district issues, but school district issues affect us as a community as a whole. And I think the city and the school district can have a great partnership in advancing diversity agendas forward. The internal diversity, equity, and inclusion committee, they have been meeting. Just last week, they met and came up with a work plan for the next 30 days. They're in the process of developing their DEI statement and charter. They're also conducting a hiring process review. I know council's had some questions about that in the past, and Mr. Steffens has gone over some of that with the Finance and Personnel Committee. But once we do this hiring process review, happy to bring that back to council for full review. They're also evaluating our value statements. We are a value-based organization. This is what we rate our employees on. And the last time the supporting statements were amended was in 2006. So we are going back and looking at those value statements to make sure that they do have an emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of our core values. As I mentioned earlier, several of our staff members attended that AWC training. And now the committee is also in the process of reviewing that ongoing staff training through our learning management software called NeoGov. And we'll be hoping to roll that out by in the next couple months here. And then an internal committee recommendation was for our website to focus businesses that are owned by BIPOC members of our community. And we're in the process of trying to figure out how best to identify those and how we can spotlight them as best we can. If you follow the City of Kent on Twitter, or even just watch the news, you can see that they've been doing that for a couple of weeks now. And a couple of our staff felt that would be a great opportunity for us as well. Welcoming community. You may have seen on social media this weekend, the Arts Commission, they met with a private business owner to review mural that focuses on DEI. This is not a city project, but they did ask for the Arts Commission's input on it. And that's going up right now on the side of the Sumner Cafe building facing Bank of America. Months ago, the Arts Commission started working on a mural that was city funded to replace the mural along the liquor store at Alder and Maple. That design has been finalized. It doesn't specifically focus on DEI, but it does have an equity component to it. and that should be starting to go up here in the next couple of weeks. We're just waiting on some agreements to be finalized. They are also continuing to look for other locations throughout the city for either city or privately funded mural installations. A lot of internal discussions have been going on about the Arts Commission in general and the concerts and movies and their events, and how to integrate council's previous comments about the Arts Commission kind of taking a lead role in being a welcoming community. And we're going to be working with them to come up with a work plan for the next biennium. And that'll be part of the official budget process. Downtown sound, I know that was brought up at one of the council meetings. We have adjusted the sound system to play a wider variety of music from artists that are people of color. We'll be monitoring that and adjusting it as necessary. The issue of crosswalks came up. I know that is on the study session agenda for September 14th, and we're working on finalizing some price estimates and a legal opinion regarding that. And then something that you might see publicly here, we're in the process of doing or we'll be putting out very shortly, a survey on our events to determine what the community's priorities are for publicly funded events, and see if we can expand any of those to celebrate our community's diversity. And then lastly, just some ongoing things. The cemetery has been working on a suffrage celebration to support the constitutional amendment allow women to vote. And this is an ongoing thing. We anticipate some sort of flag ceremony and putting flags on the grave sites in October to mark that. And also our sidewalk program, as you know, we have a volunteer sidewalk program, plus we have some access improvement money from Sound Transit. We hired a consultant last week to start working on our sidewalk planning efforts to make sure that we can fulfill the volunteer sidewalk program as well as the Sound Transit access program. And we've asked them to look at the program through an eye of equity. And when I say that, I mean, right now we have volunteer sidewalk program. Well, that's where 50% of the funding for that has to come from the property owner. And is that the best, most equitable way to do that if maybe you're not as financially stable and can't meet that 50%? This is just the tip of the iceberg of everything the city's working on. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, questions, comments, council members? I'll start calling on you. Barb, go ahead.
So on the murals, did the business need to get a permit to paint a mural on the wall? Because I know like we have the design commission and other bodies of the city that kind of help shape what people are putting on their buildings. So I was just wondering, did they go through any process or did they just do it on their own?
Sure, so murals are a little bit different. They're not a sign, they're actually considered artwork, and they do not have a permit process or a review process. That being said, the owner of that building across from City Hall felt it was important to get some input, and that's why they contacted the Arts Commission directly for just a quick review and making sure that it met the community's feel.
Yeah, and then I know the mural on the liquor store is, that was paid for with the Arts Commission money. And so there's really no length of time that those are supposed to be up, or it is just free to, change it as the Arts Commission decides.
Yeah, that's correct. There is no set time for those murals. I know that the Arts Commission, the current mural project that they're working on, they're trying to set this up to where they rotate every 4 to 5 years. So we have new, fresh art within the city, at least the publicly funded art. That's what we can control.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
Go ahead, Cindy.
Mr. Wilson, I'm impressed with your plan and your list there. I didn't know where this was going to go or how this would work out for us, but I really appreciated the training. I'm a very visual person. So, I mean, I will read the book or look at it, but seeing her talk just really made it make sense. coming from a white woman and really putting you in, you know, for myself, I can put myself in her place. And I think that's what she's trying to accomplish, is to get us to look through different eyes than we normally do. So I like your plan. I like what you've got set up going, and I'll support you in any way you can to just make sure things continue to happen. So thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Charlotte.
Jason, first of all, thank you for taking all of this seriously and for putting this together. I have comments, I think mostly for you and especially for fellow council members. What I know, like, this isn't always fun. I recognize that. And I appreciate everyone's previous support of saying that they would like to learn more or explore further. Because sometimes this could be easy procedural stuff, and other times it's going to be like uncomfortable things that we have to sit with, some thoughts, and we don't always have to have answers at every meeting. Sometimes we need to just, it's not easy, but sometimes we just have to walk away, leave a meeting saying, I don't know how I feel about that. I need to think sometimes. But I appreciate everyone's patience, and I hope that we continue to be able to look at this at least at one study session a month for a variety of reasons. And Jason, so this is where I would like, Jason, this is most of the things that I'm going to bring up were before your time as city administrator, but I'm not comfortable with us saying, hey, we've always cared about this, because that would make us responsible for every single person at City Hall. And that's not the case, because we used to have people of color at very elevated levels within City Hall who were told by our former city manager that, hey, I don't think of you as brown, as though that person should be complimented by that comment. Like, we are not free of this, and we often miss the ways that, and no one was there to like speak up for when there's wrongdoing. And this is going on in Sumner all over, which, thank you for bringing up the school district. I do think we have like a lot. I'm glad you're cooperating with them, because they're being forced to learn about issues. But also, and thank you for the Arts Commission, but we also do this in ways that we talk about Mayberry, which just also is a signal for what kind of community we want. We do other things as well, in addition to Mayberry. I'm sorry, I had some written down, but our value statements that we make, including our intro video that suggests that we like people on bicycles who are white. And those are probably the two. I'm just saying it's our own, and we're not doing it on purpose. This is where I appreciate Robin's presentation, in where she is saying, like, we need to stop thinking of racism as intended acts of evil, and instead unconscious acts of, we didn't realize what we're excluding because it's how we were raised. It's what we're surrounded by or can be. But there are things that continue to happen around us. And so I think it's important work. And I want to go back to Cindy's comments that I do appreciate, Jason, that list where there's concrete steps of action that really give us targets to keep moving toward and hitting on, and where we can show progress, and also, but hopefully sometimes we can add to it as well, but it gives us constant targets and a sort of a pathway. But to everyone, I appreciate everyone's willingness to continue sort of pushing forward.
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. And yeah, I missed the last two meetings, the study session and the council meeting, in which you discussed this, and I apologize for that, but stuff happens. But in talking to Jason, it's, I think from a staff standpoint, it's been, how do we keep on moving things forward with a limited resource, limited time we have, but still make progress on a very complex, issue. And I see this journey being a long journey. It's going to take a lot of time, but if there's ever a time to do it, it's now. And it's ever, just because of, I think, more openness towards understanding, which hasn't been there in the past. So the once a month, I think is good. Working with the school district, I think is good. I don't think there's a bad pathway, but the more people we get involved and the more things we do, the more understanding we'll have. And anyway, just my short comments. Other people, council members, anybody else have any comments? Crickets. Okay. Thanks, Jason. Speaking of Jason, city administrator report.
Nothing tonight.
Oh, darn. Agenda setting, any calendar issues between any council meetings and or committee meetings? Any calendar issues anybody has? Wow. Oh, go ahead, Cindy.
Well, I just wanted to ask a question. Is it totally okay for us to listen in on other committee member meetings that we are not members of?
List, boy. Okay, Andrea.
If there are 4 council members present at a meeting, we must notice it because that would establish a quorum. You are welcome to listen in as a member of the public if you don't intend to make any comment or speak to any issues. But if you intend to make comment or debate or dialogue about an issue, then we'd need to notice that meeting.
Okay, so it's totally fine just to go in through the website and just listen so that you're up and informed, because I feel like with as little contact as we're having with each other and with the city hall, I mean, it'd be very beneficial to hear what was going on in committee, but I wanted to make sure that that was a-okay. So thank you for that explanation.
You're welcome. You'd just be a member of the public like anyone else listening in at that point.
Okay, thank you.
Just don't say anything. Go ahead, Charlotte.
Aren't they already publicly noticed meetings? I don't understand why it would be different. I appreciate that, okay, listening in, and my understanding was always that it was then basically at the sort of the decision of the chair to allow an outside council member to ask a question or something. But given that they're already, what's the difference between a publicly noticed meeting and then a different publicly noticed meeting in a different way? What's the difference in the announcement, I guess?
So they're noticed in the fact that they're revolving meetings and that they occur regularly and they're open to the public. The difference is that if a quorum's going to be present, we have to send out special notice of the meeting, because if a quorum of the council is going to be even discussing an issue, then that constitutes action at that meeting. When there's only 3, no action can be taken. So that's the distinguishing factor. And it requires an additional special notice that Michelle would circulate in advance.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions, comments, calendar issues? Okay. I don't see any other comments or questions. There is no executive session. And this study session is adjourned at 7:33. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice rest of the evening.
Thank you.